what I'd quite like to do is to talk about factual programmes, and in particular about the BBC, because obviously that's where I work. And we always have to say this rider at the beginning about the fact that what I'm going to say to you is not BBC policy, because obviously I'm not the DG and I don't work for the Board of Governors. But so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk from my own personal perspective and from my practical experience, having worked for over 25 years in religious broadcasting. And what I want to do is to look at biblical literacy in terms of the media context in which I work, and about how programmes about the Bible fit into this world. And I'm going to concentrate on radio rather than television, otherwise we'd be here all night really in terms of the vastness of it. And also because I've worked in television in the past, my role actually for the last few years has been as editor of factual programmes in the radio side of the Religion and Ethics Department. Now my programme broadcasts about 170 hours worth of worship programmes a year, which include things like the daily service and the Sunday morning service, which we do on Radio 4. And amazingly, the daily service is now well into its 80s. It's been around, I think it's one of the longest running programmes ever that's been on the BBC. And we range through to the much newer programmes, which is only just over a year old, which is the Sunday Hour, which we do for Radio 2, which is a Christian music show. Now, all of these programmes contain regular Bible readings, and most of them are done within a worship context. So I'm not going to talk about those. I'm going to turn my attention really to biblical literacy in factual programmes, because I think there are far more significant changes of approach that have happened over the years. When I decided to think about what I was going to say on this talk, I had a look through the BBC archives to see what sort of programmes have been made about the Bible over the years. And I discovered that there were over 2,000 references, which I was quite surprised at, because for many years BBC archives have been quite selective about what they've kept. These days, with modern digital servers, we tend to keep everything. But right up until about 10 years ago, they were very selective on what they decided to keep. So actually having over 2,000 references to the Bible, which would either be significant references or programmes in their own right, is actually quite a lot. And what it revealed is a fascinating mix of programmes over the years, which looked at the Bible from a variety of perspectives. And I'm going to play you this one, if this works, from 1961.
The project of a new translation of the Bible grew from two roots, one in the churches and the other in the universities. In the universities, already before the war, there was a growing conviction among scholars that it was their duty to bring to English readers the results of the considerable advances in biblical scholarship since the last revision. The first idea was to produce another revision of the King James Version, and some tentative experiments on specimen passages were actually undertaken. But they served to convince some, at least of the experimenters, that something more radical than that was called for.
You with him? Right, that was, does anyone know who that was? Anyone know? Biblical scholars? That was C.H. Dodd, actually, from 1961, and that was the beginning of a 15-minute talk, and that was right at the beginning of the talk, which I find quite extraordinary these days. And he was talking about the new publication of the New English Bible. And it does really sound like broadcasting from another age. It's quite Reithian in the way he talks. And the other thing that struck me was how matter-of-fact it is. You know, there's no concept here of drawing listeners in. You know, it's just straight to the point with the assumption that the audience would be interested and they'd have a certain knowledge about what he was talking about. Now, contrast this with 2011 and a talk given by Simon Sharma, who's introducing the story of Noah and the Ark for the King James Bible season we did on Radio 4.
There were giants on the earth in those days. This, the inconsequential opening to the immense verses on Noah's Ark, primordial flood, were what got me when I was a child. At 6, I was the proud owner of an illustrated comic book Bible, in which the planted words of the King James Version appeared in bubble captions as though they came from the mouth of Superman. Though the illustrator couldn't go that far because the writers of Genesis didn't, I imagine those the waters rising inexorably up their bodies until they close over a last howl of desperation. That's what the King James Version was for me as a child. The ultimate brutal myth, full of terror with occasional happy endings. The worst was the binding of Isaac. Abraham commanded by God to murder his own son, just so hairy old Jehovah could be really sure of his unflinching fidelity. You wouldn't do that, would you, Dad? I asked my father. Only if you make a mess of your homework, lad, he said. Dad. It was the mad improbability of it all that got to me. 2 and 2, not 2 by 2. What? Even the mosquitoes and the vultures and the piranha fish, I wondered. Especially them, said Dad. And Noah, 600 years old when it happened. Even I knew I was pushing it a bit. But the King James Version, as always, had moments of consummate literary grace that I never forgot. The last flight of the returning dove, and lo, in her mouth was an olive leaf plucked off. On such a little thing hung the fate of the world. And then that single leaf, the entire miracle of the Bible seemed to me, at any rate, encompassed.
So, amazing difference there between then and now. And that was the entire talk. Whereas C.H. Dodd did a 15-minute talk, this was 2 minutes to introduce that particular Bible reading in the series that we did. And in that time, there's a certain amount of humour, there's an acknowledgement of not necessarily understanding what all the passages mean, but it's also mixed with a serious point at the end. And by the time he'd finished, I don't know about you, but I really wanted to hear the reading that was going to follow. And perhaps that's what is at the heart of the difference of approach between now and then. C.H. Dodd's talk was full of factual information, there was a certain seriousness, perhaps suggesting an age when people seem to have more time to listen to the radio and watch television. People were used to being given more of a lecture than a friendly chat, and they didn't really need to be enticed to listen. So, what's changed? Well, the other day I was travelling backwards and forwards to London, as I quite often do, and I'm always curious to see what sort of devices all my fellow travellers are using. And it ranged from laptops to mobiles to MP3 players and tablets from which they were consuming music, films, books, even the radio sometimes. And I'm always fascinated by this revolution in modern technology and the implications and consequences it throws up for broadcasters. Because I know from my own experience, my kids will happily listen to music on their smartphone, keep in touch with their friends on Facebook and watch television all at the same time. In fact, an Ofcom report on adults and the media, which was published earlier this year, showed that 16 to 24-year-olds spend over 24 hours a week online. And that's not all. 8 in 10 adults use the internet. And the fastest growing group, do you know which age they are on online? 65-year-olds. Largely because of the introduction of tablets. And we're not talking about the medical kind here. The BBC's own research shows that the way people consume radio is changing. There's a steady increase in the number of people listening to radio on their mobiles as they're going into work, on their computers during the day, and on tablets and mobiles in the evenings and at weekends. And from these devices, you get news, information, and entertainment 24/7. So from wherever and whenever you want, you can access a plethora of media made by a range of professional broadcasters, newspapers, commercial companies, and what we call user-generated content, which is just basically ordinary people, you know, doing their own blogs and photos and videos, whatever you want. I mean, to just give you a quirky example, a couple of years ago, my family bought a canoe, and the first place we looked for lessons on how to paddle properly was actually on YouTube, where there were at least 20 videos from canoeing enthusiasts all around the world who were happy to spend hours filming themselves canoeing and giving advice to anybody who was interested in watching. So, why am I telling you all this? It's because this is the environment in which myself and my colleagues at the BBC have to operate. The average viewer spends seconds, not minutes, deciding what programme they're going to watch. Now, thankfully for me, in radio, it's slightly longer, but we're not talking about much. And still, the demands on people's time and attention are just as intense, and it does have an impact on what is commissioned and broadcast. So we are aware that we need to give people a reason to listen, an appointment to view, to spend their precious time listening or watching the BBC, whether to be informed about what's going on in the world around them, to provide opportunities to hear about extraordinary people and worlds they might never encounter themselves, or to give people the opportunity to be entertained through music, comedy and drama. It all feels a very long way from C.H. Dodd, when in 1961 there was only the Home, Light and Third radio networks and BBC One and ITV. But in other ways there are still some similarities in 1961. The Reithian values to inform, educate and entertain are still very much at the core of the BBC. And licence fee payers should be able to find something on the BBC which appeals to them. Now, looking back at the BBC archives and the programmes that were made about the Bible also reveal something about the changing nature of broadcasting. The sheer number of programmes made about the Bible or references to it shows that the Bible is a book of important religious, cultural and literary significance. And that hasn't really diminished. But the way the programmes are made about the Bible have changed. I'm just going to play you an example of what I'm talking about.
In the first programme of this series, I asked the question, what is the Bible? And since then I've been telling the stories of people who faced up to that question in their own way for their own times. Some of the stories have been grim, indeed almost tragic, and some of them, even with such a serious subject, have had elements of comedy. But the main reason why they should interest us today is that they are not just stories. They are part of a history which continues into our own time. The history is the history of the struggle to bring the church as a place of people who look forward with enthusiasm to, for instance, a coming violent war in the Middle East, because they feel that the book of Revelation is promising that this is the beginning of the end time. And I've talked to people who
that has been a dominant reading for many hundreds of years. The idea that the book of Revelation is a guidebook to the end of time. But if we read it in its historical context, and we think of it as these images as typologies, then we can see that it's not meant to be read as a guidebook to the end of time, but as a text that
This morning's lesson, Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 1. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven.
Okay, so there you had The People of the Book, which was a 12-part series presented by Brian Redhead in 1975. Robert Beckford on Start the Week, talking about the Book of Revelation in 2010, and Paul Gambaccini, who did a quite entertaining documentary called Pop Goes the Bible in 2011. In 1984, Sue McGregor presented a programme called Tuesday Call. I don't know whether any of you remember it. And in this edition, she invited listeners to call in with questions about the Christian faith to Don Coupit and the Reverend Keith Ward. And this was in response to Coupit's controversial series, A Sea of Faith. And here's an extract in which one of the callers challenges their views on the Bible.
That it also said that Christianity is hard and arduous task worth a lifetime of study. But I request the Bible again to them again, which is the Word of God, which says God has chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, and I would tell gentlemen they can't find God with their heads.
Do you really take a literal interpretation of the Bible?
Yes.
You do, like Don Cupid?
Well, as I listen, I'm a philosopher and I try to listen very hard
and that you should seek to attempt to meet.
So, certain smugness, I think, there from some certain people on that programme. It was an interesting programme in which lots of callers challenged them on issues ranging from suffering and evil, their understanding of the resurrection, the importance of prayer, Sunday schools, the teaching of other faiths. And all the callers spoke intelligently and with a degree of knowledge of Christianity. Now, 30 years on, we cannot assume that listeners still have that level of knowledge, or will recognise quotes or be familiar with stories from the Bible. In 2009, the Sunday programme went on the streets of Manchester to test the biblical knowledge of shoppers, and this is what happened.
Do you ever read the Bible?
Yes.
Do you ever read it?
No. If I feel I need to go into it for something, yes I do. But I wouldn't sit down and say, I'll read the Bible tonight. Maybe something I'm looking for. A while ago I saw it, many years ago.
Do you know what the story is about?
It's all still Jesus, isn't it?
I know I've heard of it. Do you know where it comes from? How on earth story?
He was sold into slavery by his brothers, and he's the father's favourite son. Is it about Egypt in there somewhere? I can't remember.
The Good Samaritan is, well, what can I say? He helped a lady at the well, didn't he?
A gentleman on the road who has stopped people passing by and was married to him himself, not one of the people's favourite. He came and looked after him and took him somewhere and got better.
Thank goodness for that last person. We all knew that biblical literacy was in decline, but we didn't quite expect this to happen when we went out, and we were just basically asking people if they knew certain stories. But in a way, perhaps we shouldn't be surprised. The Ofsted report on religious education in schools, which came out last year, highlighted the quality of teaching and the lack of resources as being very patchy. And this, combined with falling attendances in many churches, especially amongst the young, creates a worrying picture. In a survey that was conducted by the Bible Society recently, 30% of secondary school children didn't identify that the Nativity was a Bible story. 46% of adults, when told the plot line of Noah and the Ark, didn't recognise it as coming from the Bible. And more alarmingly, 34% of adults thought the plot of Harry Potter was or might possibly be a Bible story. And 54% thought the same about the Hunger Games. To a certain extent, you can understand this because there is a crossover, as we sort of hinted at earlier, in terms of plot lines being inspired by or used from the Bible in Hollywood films and elsewhere. The recent Noah film is a case in point. Even in television, drama series like EastEnders have been known to take inspiration for plot lines from the Bible. But decline in biblical literacy is still of concern, and this has a knock-on effect for broadcasters in two ways. Firstly, we can no longer assume that the people we're broadcasting to have a basic knowledge of the Bible. So presenters and contributors compensate for this by providing far more context for biblical quotes and stories than would have been the case when I started in religious broadcasting 25 years ago. So I want to play an example of this from this year's Lent Talks on Radio 4. It's a series in which each year we invite a variety of writers to reflect on a particular theme associated with a passion story. This year, the theme was Power and the Passion, and these talks are broadcast to a general Radio 4 audience, as are all our religious programmes, not to a target Christian audience. And in this extract, Catherine Fox is talking about the power of submission. So just listen to the way she actually talks about the Bible and the Bible stories.
It turns out that no piece of prose, however venerable, escapes the vigilance of grammar check. Take these words from the Creed. He was conceived by the Holy Ghost, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate. For a livelier and more persuasive sentence, consider rewriting your sentence using an active verb. The Holy Ghost conceived Jesus. The Virgin Mary gave birth to him. Pontius Pilate made him suffer and crucified him. But even if we do rewrite the Creed in this livelier, more persuasive style, there is still no getting around the fact that Christ is passive here. He is the object of the sentence, not
This, of course, is what lies behind the Church's use of the word Passiontide for the period before Easter. These days, Christ's Passion is taken to be a synonym for his suffering, and of course it is, but only if we understand suffering in the right way. Not pain and misery, so much as suffering in the sense of being on the receiving end of something, being passive, not active. The word has shifted meaning in English, as we can tell from that resonant but rather baffling phrase in the King James Bible, "Suffer little children to come unto thee." This means let little children come, allow it to happen, suffer it to happen, rather than little children are suffering, which is what you might suppose it meant if you judged from the thriller and song title of this phrase. So, what lies at the heart of Passiontide is not suffering in the current sense of enduring pain, although there's certainly enough of that, but Christ being on the receiving end of things, being done to, Christ relinquishing control and ending up in the hands of others, completely at their mercy. This makes a surprising contrast to his earlier ministry, which was packed with action and powerful deeds. He preached, he healed, he worked wonders. He was in control, even of the wind and the waves.
It's quite interesting the way she does this, because all the time she's explaining aspects of Jesus' ministry and the Passion story in a way that I hope is engaging and not patronising. So that if you didn't know the story, you could still follow what she was saying. And if it was familiar to you, you could reflect on the point that she's making at a deeper level. It requires a real skill in writing for radio to make this work successfully. And it's something that we require of those who write talks for us, be it Thought for the Day or Lent Talks or any of the other talks that we do across the different networks. The second thing is, as biblical literacy in society is declining, so it's reflected in many media organisations. And this is inevitable. As younger generations are joining companies like the BBC, many of whom have come from non-religious families and have not studied RE beyond the basic required level, so their knowledge of the Bible and religious beliefs will be low. The Preble report, which was published last year for the BBC Trust, talked about low levels of basic knowledge of main and minority religions by journalists in news and current affairs. Now, several years ago, the BBC tried to address this issue by providing an online course in the BBC's College of Journalism, which covered basic facts and issues associated with a range of faiths to help journalists. But what it was not possible to do in a relatively short course was to give journalists a comprehensive knowledge of the Bible. Because at the end of the day, as with Shakespeare, I believe there's no real substitute for sitting down and reading it, not necessarily from cover to cover, but to select the most important books and stories and read them. But this problem is by no means confined to the BBC. Newsrooms are renowned as secular places. Religious stories come way down the list of editors who will focus inevitably on politics, economics, and home affairs. Religion is seen by some editors as something niche, and the Bible is a book used by and quoted by religious nutters. Now, obviously, not all editors think like that, but enough do. Politicians these days don't do God, and certainly not in public, and if they dare to put their toe in the water like David Cameron did recently with his comments about a Christian country, he received many column inches debating whether he should have said it, whether it was true, and is he Christian enough to have said it in the first place. So now I don't believe that there are deliberate attempts in the newsrooms not to cover religion. I think stories are ignored, and when they are covered, over-sensationalised, due more to ignorance and an unwillingness to engage based on a lack of knowledge and interest. So one by one, the national papers have let go of their religious affairs correspondents, and yet religious stories continue to be in the news agenda for both good and bad reasons. And yet contrast this with the Religion and Ethics Department where I work, which continues to broadcast over 400 hours of radio a year across radios 2, 3 and 4. And my television colleagues broadcast over 150 hours. Local radio has weekly religious programmes in all its 42 stations. And the audience figures are strong, and our programmes continue to be scheduled in popular slots. So we know that there's still an appetite for these programmes about religion and spirituality, even if the informed knowledge of the listeners and the viewers is not what it was. And this has an effect on radio programmes on the Bible over the years as well. there's much more of a focus on the context of its historical and cultural and literary significance rather than its theological content as a holy book. Here's an example from Beyond Belief on Radio 4.
Francesca, let me put it to you that there are archaeologists who have approached their subject with a view to undermining the biblical text. They've taken a certain delight in finding that there's no substance to the historicity of some of the Bible text.
I wouldn't say it's so much taking a delight. There have been some archaeologists who have sought to rebalance, if you like, the weight of evidence, which has always privileged the biblical text first, over and above the material remains, which tends to come second. So archaeologists more recently, particularly since the 1960s onwards, have really tried to take into account the real people who were living in these societies at the time, not just the very selective elites who are represented by the biblical texts.
Well, I think also that in general archaeological practice there's been a sort of avoidance of religion as well, you could say that. So often it's replaced by the term ritual.
So that's a sort of typical example of what you might hear on the Bible today. That was Beyond Belief, presented by Ernie Ray on archaeology in the Bible, with Professors Tim Insol and Francesca Stavrakopoulou, which was broadcast in February this year. Now, it might be worth saying something a little bit about the commissioning process here, because you might be thinking, well, why don't we just broadcast whatever we want? Well, it's not quite as simple as that. All the channel controllers have their own vision and their remit for what each network should be doing, how it should be distinctive from the other channels, who it's aimed at, the audience interests, and how they may consume the media. And this has to be agreed with the BBC Trust, because they're accountable to the audience and the licence fee payers. And so this will have an influence on what is commissioned and the style and content of the programmes made for that network. Most channels have long-running programmes which define their network. Radio 4, for instance, talks about its furniture around which everything else fits into place. So programmes like the Today programme, Woman's Hour, You and Yours, The World at One. My department has those sort of programmes in terms of Sunday and the Moral Maze and Beyond Belief on Radio 4, Coral Evensong on Radio 3, Good Morning Sunday and the Sunday Hour on Radio 2. And departments such as mine and all the indies produce and deliver a set number of programmes a year as decided by and defined by each of those networks according to what the controllers want. It's just an interesting sort of digression to talk about one of the pieces of furniture on Radio 4, which is Desert Island Discs, which is one of those secular programmes which since 1951 has had a Bible in it, which is given to all the castaways, including the complete works of Shakespeare. Unless you're from a different faith, and then you're given another holy book. And apparently its creator, Roy Plumley, decided to introduce the Bible because he thought it would have been deposited there by the Gideon Society onto the island. Anyway, back to commissioning. So ad hoc programmes like documentaries, features, discussions, these are all commissioned by commissioning editors. And all departments pitch their ideas. Now, Radio 4 and the other networks are the same. Radio 4 receives well over 1,000 ideas every commissioning round for a few hundred slots. So, as you can imagine, the competition is fierce, and factors such as originality, creativity, the importance of the subject, the topicality, the location, the presenters, are often key elements for those choosing what to commission. And any programme or any series or single programme on the Bible has to go through this commissioning process. So the ideas have to be good enough to compete with all the other ideas that they get in the commissioning round. Now, listeners love to hear something they don't know, especially on Radio 4. They love to hear a story being retold in a different way, which could be because of new discoveries or quirky angle or an unusual presenter, someone unexpected. And listeners enjoy the programmes in which they could say, oh, I didn't know that, and then go and tell all their friends about it. And this also applies to regular programmes such as Today, Woman's Hour, Start the Week, Front Row, even the Sunday programme. We all cover stories on the Bible from time to time, but we only do so if we can think of a fresh or different way of doing it. And these are a few little clips from the Sunday programme, which decided to take, over the years, a quirky look at the Bible.
is full of under the spotlight now because of an auction of massive memorabilia which has just begun. Among the items for sale is a Bible that was taken to the moon. Carol, which is the author of a book called Fossils. Now, if you believe that every word of the Bible is inspired by God, I don't think this next item is for you. The iconoclastic Christian website, The Ship of Fools, is launching a poll to find the worst verse in the Bible. In a moment, I'll be talking to the website's co-editor, but first, here are some possible contenders.
Oh, Babylon, Babylon, the destroyer. Happy the man who repays you for all that you did to us. Happy is he who shall seize your children and dash them against the rock.
Surely in vain the net is spread in sight. Proverbs 1:17. I will lift up the cup, Psalm 116, verse 30. Those are among the nuggets mined from the Bible for their relevance to football by Rabbi Jonathan Romaine, who said members of his congregation in Maidenhead in Berkshire have been pestering him about whether he would be praying for an English victory in today's World Cup game with Germany. Rabbi, are you perhaps stretching upwards a tiny bit here?
Oh, absolutely right. But you have to regard these things with a sense of humour. But on the other hand, people say that the Bible applies to every aspect of life, and if you delve hard enough, you can always find what you want.
So those are items which were a sale of a microfiche Bible, which was taken into space. There was a poll by a Ship of Fools to find the worst Bible verse, and Rabbi Jonathan Romaine trying to help the England football team with the use of the Bible, and let's hope England does better this time round. And as you see, again, it's looking at quirky ways of covering, in effect, what we would call the same story, because obviously the Bible is the Bible, and obviously the contents of the Bible don't change, and it's always trying to find a different way of coming at the same thing. Now, one of the boldest projects Radio 4 commissioned in the last few years on the Bible was to mark the 400th anniversary of the King James Bible. And of all the translations, it still remains one of the most popular and influential books in the English language. And Radio 4 decided to devote 10 hours of airtime to it. There was to be 28 readings from the Bible by actors such as Sam West, Amelia Fox, Hugh Bonneville, Miriam Margolyes and Niamh Cusack. And these were to be introduced by the likes of Simon Sharma, David Lodge, Ron Self, Rowan Williams, Frank Cottrell Boyce, Joanne Harris, etc., etc. And they would provide their own insight and reaction to the readers, to the readings that the listeners were about to hear. And the readings and essays alone that were to be broadcast across a single day, and they were to have 7.5 hours worth of airtime, which is quite a commitment from a broadcaster. Now, this isn't the first time that Radio 4 have run a season of Bible readings like this. I don't know if any of you remember the Canongate series, which came out in, I think, 1998, and that was broadcast. But nothing quite on this scale was attempted before. And the reason why Radio 4 was so confident that this would appeal to the general audience can really be summed up by Simon Sharma in his introduction to the Day of Readings.
400 years ago, in the spring of 1611, when the King James Bible was published by the royal printer Robert Barker, an imperishable masterpiece was born. It's the version which, for sheer poetic force, epic drive, and sensuous beauty, has defeated all attempts at vulgar modernisation. Beside the King James Bible, newer versions that write manuals of plumbing. It even lodges permanently in the sensibility and memory of old Jews like me, who disbelieve much of what it says. It's the way that it says it that still rings majestically through a prosaic world.
Well, who could argue with that? The season began with Jim Nocty's 3-part documentary series, and it told the story of the creation of the King James translation and the Bible's subsequent influence. And it was broadcast across 3 days in prime time at 9 o'clock in the mornings after the Today programme. And I just wanted to play you a couple of extracts from programmes 2 and 3 because they illustrate quite well how documentaries on the Bible are made today and what they sound like, which is quite important. Location, historical, social, cultural context are always ways of engaging the listeners and drawing them in. And by finding ways of connection, we then use those to, in effect, give the listener a history lesson. The series was described by the radio critics at the time as a luxurious thing which revelled in the detail and evocative landscapes. So we'll see what you think.
From Hampton Court to the Bodleian Library. Yesterday we were on the scene of King James's conference to commission a new translation of the Bible. Today we're at the place where some of the scholars settled down to their task. There were 6 groups, each responsible for a different part of the Bible, and some of the most important work was done here in Oxford. And here with the writer Adam Nicholson in the main courtyard of the Bodleian Library, a magnificent place with high above us, Adam, the Tower of 5 orders of those magnificent classical columns, and a statue of James himself, rather magnificent.
He is, isn't he? And he would have loved to have seen himself there. He came there in 1605 to visit the scholars at Oxford, and again in 1620 when this yard was finished. And he sits there presiding over a great machine of scholarship. He thought of himself as a grand intellectual king, but also as a great peacemaker. And over him it says, Beati Pacifici, blessed are the peacemakers. Because in Scotland where he'd been brought up, it had been turmoil for decades. And he tried to reconcile all the warring factions in Scotland. 1603, arrives in England, thinks, right, I'm going to sort out a reformation that had never really been finished. And my main way of doing that is with a new Bible. Now let's look at the right-hand side, one of the oldest coaching inns in London, the George and Southwark, where you can sense those past times. An age, for example, when the Bible was the only book in the whole, when the King James, the authorised version, was read in every church at every service. You remember here that the language passed from pulpit to the street. So much of the English language we know even today has that book as its source and its inspiration. The legacy is all around us. With me here in the inn by a welcome roaring fire is Gordon Campbell, Professor of International Studies at the University of Leicester, whom we met at Hampton Court. And it's worth being here, Gordon, isn't it? Because it reminds you how the language came out of the church, this somewhat archaic language in many ways, and embedded itself in the culture of the everyday.
Indeed, and pubs in general, are places where linguists like to go for precisely that reason.
And the phrases from the Bible that crop up, unknowing to many people, in our everyday speech.
Oh, absolutely. So if we say something like fly in the ointment, or go the second mile, or lick the dust, or, my boss is a thorn in the flesh, those are all phrases that could have been articulated in this very pub. And were we to use any of them, no one would say, yes, that's a biblical allusion, because those origins have been lost. I survived by the skin of the teeth. No one thinks of that as biblical, and yet it was transmitted from the church to this very pub and thousands like it.
I always think good radio documentary has a squeaky door in it somewhere. As you can see, all the time, we're trying to draw people into the story, by using familiar places like pubs, places that you could go and visit if you wanted to, giving it quite a rich sound. And then as people get drawn into it, the programs then develop much more into, so what was going on here, what was in the Bible, what were people talking about, what was the theology. But it's all dressed up all the time in, sort of rich landscapes and hooks that people can sort of feel like, well, I don't know anything about this, but I've been in pubs, I understand all about that. And so that's how we try and do it. So the documentaries were quite straightforward to make. The readings, on the other hand, were a very different order. And my role, or should I say my mission, was to abridge the Bible into 28 13-minute episodes. And at the beginning, it really did seem like mission impossible. After much thought, I decided the best way to do it was to go for Bible stories which would appeal to everyone regardless of whether they had read the Bible before. And my hope was that people would enjoy the readings on different levels. So for those who are familiar with the Bible, they would enjoy hearing it in the eloquent language of the King James. For those with a vague knowledge of the plot lines of some of the stories, it was an opportunity to hear the stories in full and in context. And for those with no knowledge or even interest in the Bible, it was an opportunity to listen to tales of love, compassion, greed, jealousy, anger, betrayal, and death. Experiences, in effect, of what it means to be human, and giving people an understanding of our place in the world. So we did a whole range of episodes, well, 28 obviously, and we did things on Noah, on Abraham and Isaac, we did Joseph, we did Moses, we did Ruth, obviously the story of Jesus from birth to crucifixion, we did a bit of Paul, and we finally ended up with a bit of Revelation. Straightforward stuff, you might think, well, no, not really. I was very thankful that back in the day I had done a degree in theology, because right from the start we had theological problems trying to do it. Take episode 1, the creation. Of course, for those who know, actually there are 2 creation stories. So which one do you go with? You know, actually neither of them were long enough for a 30-minute episode. So do you combine the 2 together? Which is actually what we did in the end. There were discussions on what to keep in, what to lose from the escape of Moses and the Israelites. That was far too long, that had to come down. You know, what do you do with Job? You know, over 40 chapters of Job and you've got 13 minutes to do it in. It was a fascinating thing to do, but it was quite hard work. The only big omission, I think, in the series that we had was the lack of Psalms. Because I had several goes at trying to abridge a collection of Psalms, and for various reasons it just didn't work, and so in the end we dropped them. But interestingly enough, not one person complained or noticed that there were no Psalms. So it was a big theological challenge, but it was quite enjoyable. And the other aspect which I quite enjoyed was working with, we have a readings department which are responsible for doing all the numerous book readings that go across Radio 4. And they helped us to secure some of the big name actors and to record some of the readings, because there was quite a lot of recording that had to take place in actually quite a short period of time. And what was fascinating about this collaboration was working with people whose biblical literacy was very low, but people who were totally engaged with the project. So I would often spend half an hour on the phone talking to the producer about the context, meaning and significance of each reading. Conversations which would end up being fascinating theological discussions, and they'd enjoyed it just as much as I did. And these conversations enabled them to work with the actors in a way that they could get the most out of each reading. But all through the process, our aim was to create self-contained episodes which could be enjoyed by everyone, regardless of their knowledge or understanding of the Bible. The readings were then made available as podcasts, and we had over 250 downloads. And eventually we were awarded the Sanford St Martin Prize for our efforts, which was quite nice. So I'm just going to play Amelia Fox, who you might know as being a pathologist.
And there arose a great storm of wind, and the waves beat into the ship, so that it was now full. And he was in the hinder part of the ship, asleep on a pillow. And they awake him, and say unto him, Master, carest thou not that we perish? And he arose, and rebuked the wind, and said unto the sea, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said unto them, Why are ye so fearful? How is it that you have no faith? And they feared exceedingly, and said one to another, What manner of man is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?
So that was Amelia Fox, who was one of, I think there were 10 actors altogether who took part in the series. The essay, each reading was accompanied by a little essay. So you heard the one earlier, which Simon Sharma did for Noah and the Ark. And these essays were another attempt to draw the listeners in, especially for those who had little interest in religion or in the Bible. And so we use well-known figures from the world of history, literature and religion, such as Simon Sharma, Will Self, David Lodge, Howard Brenton, Joanne Harris, and several others, to engage and talk to the audience about the impact that these stories had had on themselves. Because we thought it just might entice those people who thought it wasn't for them to listen. Because if those people liked it, then perhaps I might have a go. And so, just for a little flavour, here's Will Self.
I never think I'm particularly well versed in Scripture until, that is, I begin to read it, and then all those sessions vividly return, wherein I see myself, together with a group of small children, sat on a musty school carpet and listening to Bible stories. be read aloud to an audience. My family were hardly great church attendees, but we went enough that the school storytelling was augmented from the pulpit. And this, too, is in keeping with another sense of the Gospels, for this was the term also applied to a proclamation in the Roman Empire. Those proclamations, in three-quarters empty and fusty Anglican churches, seemed to have little authority at the time. We lounged, we fidgeted, we picked. But each time I read the Gospels again, I am struck by how deeply I feel I know this fourfold story, how believable and intimate the biographies of Jesus Christ are, and how sinewy, how chewy even the prose is, with its mass of allusion not only to the fabric of our ethical and spiritual thought, but also to our psychology.
Of course, series like these can only ever be made every so often. But I hope, as you heard from all the clips that I played, programmes about the Bible or talking about it as a reference point, historically, literary or culturally, will still continue to be made. But the big question is, for how long? If biblical literacy amongst the general population continues to fall, for how long will new generations of broadcasters continue to see the Bible as something they should engage with and make programmes about? Having mentioned the Bible's influence on history, culture and literature, I do find it strange that the Bible is only really studied at school, if at all, in RE lessons. Surely it should be part of the curriculum for a number of subjects. On the Sunday programme a while ago, we ran an interview with a historian who worried about the lack of biblical and religious knowledge of their students at university. As they said, how can you understand certain periods of history without the knowledge of the Bible and the beliefs that come from it and their subsequent influence on politicians and society of the day? And it's a question that could be asked of those studying English literature or even art. It's also a question that broadcasters need to ask. Already I've seen and heard programmes made, not from my department or necessarily even on the BBC, about historical events in, say, the 15th, 16th centuries, where there was no reference at all to religious beliefs that underpin the society, never mind references to the Bible. I don't know why, but I suspect that if programme makers have little or no knowledge or interest in religion or the Bible, then they will not appreciate its significance. So if the Bible is not engaged with as widely as possible, then lack of biblical literacy will continue to grow. Perhaps there's a role here for broadcasters to continue to produce programmes about the Bible, and by doing so it might help in some way to slow down this decline and to help make the Bible relevant and come alive for subsequent generations. That's me. Thank you.